Writing from the soul is the mother of all invention, and 21 Grams is back for another season of this exploration. We will look into the artist and the art they create. Except, this season we're adding the questionnaire, invented by the great Bernard Pivot, to go even deeper. They say 21 grams is the weight of the soul, and this show is the scale. So now here's your host for 21 grams, Joe Compton. Yes, hello everybody. We're live Friday night, 21 grams. Nice to have you all here. Thank you for joining us. And look who I've got. I've got the awesome Claudia Blood with me. I'm real excited about this. Claudia, as I always do with this show, I always love to give the guest the opportunity to kind of tell us a little bit more about themselves, expand upon who they are and what they do a little bit. So I'm going to give you the floor to start with. So please tell everybody a little bit about you.
Okay, so I'm kind of a nerd. I have an IT background and I play D&D, and I, with science as my degree in college. So I'm a nerd. And I love writing things with magic and science and putting in like crazy creatures and having these weird things just happen. And I very much love being a writer. So I have fantasy series, I have sci-fi series, and I have sort of a fantasy with a supernatural sort of twist to it. And so it's pretty fun. That's the background on me.
Well, Anita says hello. Hi, Anita. Nice to see you. Yeah, it's, the thing I found fascinating about your work and what you do, and we'll talk about the cross-genre thing because that's been a big topic for this season of this show. But the idea is, for you, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me you like to take characters, put them in situations where they're in peril, and kind of see where all of that goes with that. Is that kind of a fair assessment of how
I
you...
do. My poor characters.
So, I mean, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm not kind to them, and they do get themselves into a world of hurt, and it really makes them question themselves and the things that they want. So,
yeah. So I'm curious, with that mindset and that mentality, is the approach of writing for you is it a cathartic exercise? Is it a I want to try this scenario, so let's see if this character is up for it kind of idea? How does the approach work for how you put these characters in with the situations they're in?
it's a puzzle piece, and you don't really. I'm a pantser. I know everybody hates that, but I totally. I have this concept, an idea, and a character, and I have a vague idea of where I'm going, and then or a scene that just like speaks to me, and then I'll put the character on the page and be like, all right, what can I do to you to make you respond to what's going on? So, like Ravine, her daughter died. So how do you respond if you are a famous and very brilliant scientist who invented almost fastest light drive? What would you respond? Well, of course you try to invent time travel. I mean, who wouldn't, right?
All right. How much of you is in these characters that you're torturing?
There's probably little bits and pieces inside of there. Some of the things okay, so when you guys read about some of the terrible things Ravine does, she's not me. I would not do that. Airlocks and scientists getting out into space, that's not I wouldn't do that. So there's a little bit of me inside of there. And then other people in other situations, like you see somebody do something and you're just like, why would someone do that? Like, what would motivate someone to do that? And I think that, you get curious.
So then where does the science part pop in for you? Is it right away? Is it a hypothesis that you create and kind of work through? Is it something that you've read about? Is it something that you know about? Where does the science fit into what you're trying to structure around the character and their torture?
So I've got something and I'll answer this sort of like with a little bit of a story. I've got something that I love Beat Saber. So this is what I use as my exercise, right? And hitting the lightsabers and all that. And I had this okay, it's visual, it's impacting your brain. There's research about how you can reprogram your brain, sort of like the things that you watch and it affects your brain. And I was like, what if the government decided that they were going to use Beat Saber to train soldiers?
Mm.
What if, right? And then you get that what if, and you go, okay, well, then if that's my premise, how could I test that? Like, how could I put somebody in a situation that that would be like a terrible thing or like would really force them to do something they didn't want to do? I've got some great characters. Yeah.
Do they speak to you? Or are you one of the people that has that happen to them where the characters talk to you a little bit?
I will, when I really get in the zone, I'll be typing along and something will happen that I didn't sit down writing thinking this was going to happen. And suddenly something happened as I was like, oh, right. Like, and you have, you're like, yeah, okay, okay. Yeah. And
Is
sometimes you
it
get my character's voice and you're just like, this
uh,
Ravine is going to respond this way. It is not logical. This is her logic and the way she sees the world. And it's what she's going to do.
so has any of your characters challenged your scientific point of view when you're trying to write through that?
Um, I have characters who don't believe in science very much, and they don't think,
Wow.
right? Like, yeah, they just don't. They're like, science. It's just, if I can't, it's not that I can't see it. It's like this weird, like, if it's almost like okay, flat earthers. If I actually physically can't see the Earth being round, then it therefore cannot be. But they believe in magic. It's the weirdest thing. So it's like,
Yeah.
I don't understand your world, but okay, it's like who they are. But yeah,
Yeah, it's an interesting there's a lot of dichotomy that goes along and a lot of like you know just just a lot of hypocrisy that goes along with a lot of things that people who usually have a stern belief in something, they kind of change and set, they accidentally slip and give you a little bit, well, that's really science or that's really this, right? And you
right.
kind of go, and if you call them out on it, then it's like, oh my god, you just created a world of hurt for yourself. But
Well, there's also that whole thing that there's the theoretical construct of something, like something
mm,
theoretically, like I'm going to respond this way. But when it actually happens to you and it's people that you love and care about in that situation, you don't know how you're going to respond, dude. There's no way, right? Like you're not going to be all logical. You've got your emotions in there and that sort of twists what you might do. So,
so you've mentioned you're a self-proclaimed nerd, especially when it comes to D&D and role-playing games and things of that nature.
yep.
So do you approach your character build in the same way that you approach it building in a D&D game or a role-playing game? Is that how you kind of set it apart? Or is it putting the character in the story and letting the story kind of build how the character becomes who they are?
It's the second. I really tried in the beginning to do character sheets and you'd
Mm,
have, your charisma modifier and your strength modifier and like all their little traits that they do, right?
right.
And the problem was is I couldn't connect with them. Like I couldn't unless and that was the same way, like unless I'm playing a character in D&D and you have them in the story and they're, killing the princess or saving the princess or whatever it is that they're doing, right? Like you,
Yeah.
you don't really connect with them until that you've got them running through scenarios or they're actually doing something or making choices, right? Like they're choosing to steal the treasure versus choosing to, save the party. Not that my character's ever done that. But you know what I mean? So
Yeah,
I
totally.
didn't end up doing that. So I have bare minimum character traits. I have a vague idea of who they are, and then I put them through the paces and say, okay, the Duchess, the house exploded and it takes out your family, and you're a hacker. How are you going to handle this? Let's see what's going to happen. And then you kind of get to know them and the actions that they do and what feels authentic for who, like it builds up in your head over time, not just like a flat character sheet.
I'm curious what you feel like role playing games and writing prose and novels and narratives. What is one similarity that you found, or one thing that you've gained from role playing games that have you added to your repertoire in writing narratives that people might be surprised about?
So there's two things. So role-playing games, I don't think I ever would have explored as much with different types of characters if I didn't have a diverse set of characters that I played,
That's
and
cool.
I kind of like pushing like you're not just the fighter, the barbarian with your, great axe or whatever. You're, you're a beguiler and you're a little, hobbit like whatever, and you're trying to use politics, which is not my thing, but I was trying, right? Like I was, how do you get in the mindset of doing that and of manipulating? Because that's a manipulation type of character. So I think it helped me put myself in, or helped mindsets better. And then
Mhm.
also with, and I play Dungeons and Dragons, there's also sort of like, there's structure to it, right? Like your initial adventures in the whole series, it's all very basic, like, oh, you have to save the person from the well, or the house is really spooky, or whatever, right? And then if your characters go through all of the things and end up as 20th level characters, there's like layers upon layers that get added on that sort of, you don't realize that that dude that you saved is suddenly the bad guy over here, right? And he's, the witch's familiar or whatever, whatever. And so I think it helped me really like build the layers and realize, okay, there's the simple things that they're thinking about, but there's like that bigger picture for the bigger series that I've always found intriguing. So,
Is your construct? I know you're a pantser, but is your
yeah.
construct to create it through a series, or does the series kind of come with you discovering through the character? At what point do you really feel like you're going to write this as a series?
The first time that I ran into that, I started writing and realized that I did not have everything that I needed for it to make sense. Right.
Mm,
Like I ended up starting in the middle of book 2 with the scene about, the jungle and time travel and a aerobics instructor who ended up, coming in a burst of light. And as I was trying to write around that, I was like, oh man, I started like in the middle of the story. Like I need all this stuff. Like, how did time travel happen? Well, who were they trying to do? Who started the company? Right. And you end up sort of like building that whole work around it. And I've only managed to make short stories into one thing. Like everything seems like it could be a series. Like, here's all the possible things that could happen.
mhm.
And then are you interested in writing it, right? Like every time you write a book and you write something, you're always like, what are you focusing on and what are you interested in? Do you want jail politics when they're on the prison moon? Nope, I don't want to write that, but I'm really interested in, this part with, stealing spaceships and, super volcanoes, right? Like that part, yeah, I can focus over here. So yeah, I think that answered your question.
Yeah, I find it interesting because it's kind of a blessing and a curse as a
Yeah,
pantser to kind of you do develop a lot of different avenues and different lanes you can travel through, but then you have to rein it in. And then
yep,
when you go and try to do discovery on those other lanes for maybe like book 2 or 3 or 4 down the road, you realize that that's the middle of the lane, so you have to go backwards a little bit and kind of create
yes,
what the path was to get there, kind of. So it could be a
absolutely.
blessing and a curse. You have the meat, but how did the meat get born, right? Kind of idea.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. It's an ecology almost like yeah, there's a whole system to it. And then I don't know if you get this with the pantsing too, like, I get my pants on and or I don't, I guess I'm running around with no pants on, and then suddenly I have to pause and be like, "Alright, I need to take a moment, and I need to, like, put all the stuff that I have in my head down on the page and rearrange bits and go, am I still heading for the right direction? Like, am I still going to Alaska? I don't know, let's figure it out." And then it makes it, like, easier to get over that hump of, "Okay, if I have this choice, we're going this way because that's what makes sense to the overall thing that you're
See, I'm a
writing."
I'm a torturous pantser. I
Okay,
torture I torture myself when I write, and
o
that I anything that comes out of my head, I just dump it on the page. I don't care where it is on the page, and a lot of
okay,
times that hurts me in the end because I go back and go, What the hell is this? Why is this in there? This makes no sense, right?" But it was
right.
in my mind at the time, so I was just writing it and I wrote it out, or I'll put it off to the side and put it in a little note because I use
Yep,
Google Docs a lot, so I would
yep.
put it in the note section so that it's a little note to myself, "Hey, go back and look at this." And I almost got in trouble with my second book because I had put a little note to verify some certain, like I was doing some like hospital jargon, and I
Mhm,
wanted to verify that that hospital jargon jived with what was going on in the scene. And I put
right.
a little note to the side saying, check, do the research and double check this, right? And nobody caught it. No editor caught it. Because when the editor comes in, they don't see my notes because I don't
Right,
share my notes, but
right.
so they didn't see it, so they didn't have any idea. And then when I was going through their changes, I go, wait a second, they changed some word here, and then I realized that I had a note about why it needed to be changed or what was going, and I had to go back and rewrite that whole part.
Yep.
But I mean, I luckily figured that out. But that would have been like,
That could
wow,
have
that
been
would have been a
bad.
big hole in that story.
Right. Right.
you
And you
know?
do what you can to try and make sure there's no holes.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Especially as a pantser where you're like, "Ooh, did that make sense?"
Anita says, "Yeah, good choice. Avoid the politics." Yeah,
Yes. Yes.
it's hard though, especially if you're world building. That's a difficult aspect, especially in role playing. It's impossible. I mean, the politics are going to be part of the of the quest typically,
Absolutely.
right? So
Yep. You're always choosing sides regardless.
yeah, and that's
Yeah.
the point of role playing, right? Is
Yep.
to the hero's journey or the villain's descent or whatever, kind of idea, right? So
Yep.
but I mean, for narrative though, politics and religion are kind of those things I personally feed into the politics. My whole book's about all three of my books are about politics, but the religious aspect is where it gets a little gray for me. You also don't want to offend anybody, right? You don't want
Right.
to alienate
Right.
an audience either, right? So
And I do struggle with if the character, if that's truly what they believe and they're an asshole, right? I'm not
yeah,
saying I believe that. I'm saying that character who's an asshole believes that, right? Like,
yeah.
and it's authentic to who they are. So, and then you like worry, like, well, do you change it? Do you keep them an asshole? I mean, they
Soften
are.
it,
So,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that you're someone who explores all kinds of different genres,
Mhm.
and I mean we've talked about this incessantly on panels you've been on and talked about your name being being everybody assumes you write horror because of
Yeah.
your name
Yep.
and they want to know the origin story of the name versus what you write and kind of idea. But have you always been apt to kind of cross genres? Was there ever a time when you thought about I'm gonna stick into one lane and just ride that out? Because I'm finding that that's been a big topic this season on the show is that the genre crossing genres within even the same thing you're writing often is
Mhm.
not as fearful as it used to be. Like we're nobody's afraid of losing an audience member for what they write.
For what they write.
Yeah.
I thought I was gonna be a horror writer for a long
Mhm.
time, as the name, says. Um, and I think it didn't speak to me, right? Like,
Mhm.
I couldn't really delve into the type of horror that really like, I had kids, and then suddenly I'm like, "I already have these horrible visions, I do not need help," you know, doing realistic, horrible things. Nope, 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 we're moving back from that. And then I thought I could do romance. Like, I love romance as a genre. It's so I don't know. So at the happy endings, right? Like you know what you're gonna get. You get
Yeah.
the beats are very distinct. I can't write it. Like I would love to be able to write it, but I'm always like, and then the zombie apocalypse came, right? And it just like totally ends up going far away.
Yeah.
So, but I think that as everything has changed with the industry, right? Because it used to be that there were specific shelves that you went to and you knew what you were getting and they were sci-fi and here's the spaceships, right? Or whatever. Um, that you knew what you're getting. Well, now there's not. The marketing is more like it's a different sort of branding. It's not, it's you as a writer, Joe, that they're interested in and they love you to push them a little bit, right? And
Yeah.
not saying that there aren't people who will only read one particular genre, but I do think that they're more open to reading other things. And maybe they always were. And they
Mhm.
just never got that opportunity because things kept so straight and narrow.
Well, I think also that genres get saturated, and oftentimes, if you're reading the same thing over and over again, you're going to go back to the person that started that. You're not going to go and find somebody new who's doing the same thing because it doesn't. So, being able to kind of cross over and add a little of fantasy to your science fiction or horror to your science fiction
Right.
that changes the game for you and you become a little bit more of ooh that guy did that really well even though I'm privy to the or I'm more partial to the old science fiction that I know this is a unique and different way of telling that story, and I get it, and that's kind of cool. And
And
so
that's kind of cool.
you gain audience that way as well, right? So
Well, and then life isn't just in that lane, right? Like we have
right,
science and we have, magic and, everything else. I mean, and it's different. Like people believe in magic and witches and everything else, and that's totally cool. But it all is still in our same world. And there's romance and there's horror and there's procedurals. So why wouldn't somebody, if you could do it well, now if you can't, that's a whole different thing. But why not have all those different elements if you're doing a full system or you're,
yeah.
in your side of your book? Why not?
Has creating magic systems conflicted with your science brain a little bit, or have you found that's never been a problem?
So it's very logical to me. Like the magic has to follow rules. So as long as it follows rules, then I'm okay. Because what's that joke about? Today's magic is tomorrow's science.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. So it's just so my thing on magic is we just don't understand it. Maybe it's magnetics. Maybe it's But who am I to say that that doesn't exist when they used to think that silver was good for babies or whatever, right? Like or any of the other things that they gave us that they thought were
Yeah,
good.
our teeth fillings used to be mercury, right? So
Right, right. I mean, just all the crazy things. So no, the science, as long as it follows rules, so it can't be random, it can't be, or if it is random, it's random for a very specific reason, right? Like an outburst sort of thing, or they don't understand it. So yeah, I'm fine with magic. In fact, zombies are magic. They cannot be science. That's one of those hills I'm willing to stand on.
why is that? To explain that for me a little bit.
So, okay, if there's zombies with science, they don't have a circulation system, they don't have a heart, the whole potassium channel thing doesn't work, right? Like they
Mm,
don't, where do they get their fuel from? Because nothing is an
mm.
ever whatever machine, yeah. So whenever I see a zombie movie, I'm like, magic, 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 it's magic, right? Because it can't be. What virus does that? All the little ants that turn into zombies, they die. They go down to the bottom of the leaves and they die. So anyway, so yes, I always say magic is for zombies.
So being a science person and that, do you find you spend a lot more time refining your magic system or working on certain elements more than what the story might even require, just because you are so into it?
I try not to get bogged down because you know how easy it is to get into
Yes.
something and work on something that, holy cow, that's really super cool. And it took me a month and I'm only going to use like 2% of it. So, I do try what I do focus on is that it's rules based and it's balanced and that there's, the conservation of energy.
Mm.
And there's right, like I have like in my head as I'm thinking, oh, that spell's going on. Where'd the energy come from for that? Like, how does that? Is that like, and I do think about like crazy things together like that. And it makes sense in my head, so I go with it.
Kind of walk us through some of your series. So to talk a little bit about the first series you created and what it's about and certain things about it.
So the first book that I published was, I think it was At the Cabin. And that was it's got doppelgangers and a ex FBI agent who's a terrible handyman who ends up in this weird he gets kidnapped and ends up naked on a bed that this woman ends up coming to, and an arson comes and is going to burn down the cabin because they're using them as body doubles. I mean, like who doesn't come up with things like that? And so they ended up turning into a team. And then the next book, In the Woods, is sort of finding, continuing that story. So it's set in like by Ely, Minnesota. And
Mm,
it's a lot of supernatural creatures, a lot of not, it's not a true mystery. I have to be careful because in the beginning of the book, you know who the bad guy is. There are secrets and things, but you know who the bad guy is because there's the POV on it. And it's
mm,
how do they get out of it that's the fun part and what are they missing? Um, and so then the second series was the Relic trilogy, and that is a distant future jungle planet and time travel. And the gist is the Ravine from the other series lost her daughter, decided to create time travel, found where time particles were, took over the planet and like planted her own scientists, ripped open a time rift, and ended up basically doing these big cycles back and forth to try and over hundreds of years to save her daughter. And so this was one particular thing at the end of all of that where these orphans end up confronting the company and figuring out how to save the world to close the time rift and save the world, their planet Kalika, and get rid of the company that was squishing them. um, and the Relic, the Renegades Rising, is Ravine's story. So how did they get to Kalika? How did the company become? How did the time rift open? Why did they have assassins on this planet? And were they training orphans to be assassins? Like, how did all of that happen? So that's what those books are sort of leading up to. And
That's
then the
awesome.
last one, yeah, is the Merge series, and that's Smith and you and our world smashing together. And it's the main character in the first book is Lighthouse, and he flew through time and ended up as a human protection detective, an agent, and the world is about to explode again. And so each book is basically another person trying to save that merged world from getting destroyed. See, there's a lot of getting destroyed world things in my books, I've noticed, and terrible things happening to the characters.
I also noticed that you like to cross dimensions and to go beyond a little bit. Is that is that is that just your curious nature as a scientist to do that?
Wouldn't it be fun though if you could do that? If you could like
Sure.
see, the whole time travel thing has always been fascinating. I wouldn't want to change what happened in the past, but could you imagine looking at it and understanding the future better by looking at the past directly? It'd be, I don't know. But yes, I get super curious about how things fit together and, other worlds and other dimensions, and you just don't know what's really possible. And it's weird that I do have the science background and I do believe in science, but there's a lot of things out in the world we don't know. So,
Yeah, I mean,
right?
there is for sure.
For sure.
Uh, you know, I'm curious about the POV aspect of how you write. How do you decide what POV you're writing from? Is it just come to you? Is that something that you work out from the beginning, or do you like to change POVs and try some different things out?
So I tend to, it's not planned. So again, I'm a pantser, but have you ever written that scene and you write out the scene and then you're like, this is wrong. Why is this wrong? Ah, crap, it's the wrong POV. And then you have to rewrite the whole entire scene in this other person's POV because it was a better view of the scene, whether it's the emotional view or of what's going on or like the overarching thing that you have going on. It should have been in this other person's point of view. So you rewrite the whole thing. And then it changes. So, you get a different scene anyway. So
Do
not
you
planned.
do you like writing from a singular or like from first person? Is that typically how you engage it?
I don't, okay. So, when you're growing up as a young writer, they tell you that first person is a terrible thing to write and you need to
Yeah.
write in third. So I kind of trained myself out of doing first person and do more third past tense.
Mm.
So yeah, everything is mostly third person, I think, on everything. So
Have you thought about first person at all?
I have a couple of things that are, they're weird for me, but they're first person. And I always worry that if you do first person, that people are going to think even more that that character is really you, the author, and not the character. So, and especially with some of the things my characters do, it's like, dude, I would really do that. Come on, I'm not going to kill people. I'm
Does
kidding, sure.
does time travel get tricky with third person past? Is that a little bit of a tricky trek to kind of a slope to kind of slalom a little bit?
So it's funny because they're always present in whatever time that they're in, and so then trying for them to figure out where they are, like, that gets a little weird with, but you don't but the past it's the multiple person thing when you think about it. So if you've got the same character in the same time in different locations and making sure that that's distinct when they're there through different chapters, that's the only weird. It's like, "Oh, it's me number 2." It's Ravine number 1 and Ravine number 2, so you call them Old Ravine and Young Ravine? Like, how do you it's the same character, but, like, different time frames, so that part gets a little weird.
Ravine from the future, or
Yeah, Ravine from, like, the first Ravine,
right.
or who's totally crazy and into robots, or, like, is it the Ravine that's in the current timeline, who's not quite as crazy?
And keeping track of that in a series has to be fun, I would imagine.
Yeah, yeah, and I haven't it's in my head, it's like these circles that go around in my head that I'm like and it feels like a chess game too, right? Because 'Cause I've also got an alien and Ravine who are each trying to thwart each other because they've got their own goals, so they end up in the supercomputer and they set up traps for all the different people that are in the world to try and prevent whatever it is that they want prevented.
Okay, so as a pantser, you've written it, you put
Yep,
it out there,
yep.
and then you're continuing on from that. Do you go back and reread what you wrote from the first from the previous entry to kind of get you started with the second one, or are you revved up? Do you just rev up right into the second one or third one or whatever? Do you rev up into the next book just on its own and kind of go back and try to connect the dots?
I rev up in the second book on its own with notes about, "Okay, I don't remember what happens in the scene, go back and check, go back and check, go back and check," right? Like, because
Yeah.
yeah, that was, like, 2 books ago, I don't remember what happened. Like, I don't know. But then I have to go back and actually read some things and be like, "Oh, crap, I can't do that because of this. Oh, let me change that." I bet you've probably got the same thing, right? When you
Mhm.
circle
Oh yeah.
back and you're like, "Ooh, hmm."
Well, my whole problem was I wrote my first book I wrote as I intended it just to be a standalone, but so many people were asking me for a sequel. What happens next? What's going on? Where do these characters go? And I ended up folding to a publisher who wanted to publish my work. They wanted me to continue the series, so I went ahead and wrote a second book, which was about almost 8 years after I wrote the first one. And so going back, and it was kind of weird to write that, but yeah, I did a lot of note taking and that. But the problem that I had was then I needed to write a third one, and then doing that, connecting all the dots.
All the
So
dots.
going back
Yeah.
to the first one, was just a treacherous road that I went down that I don't think I've still come back from yet. So
I mean, it's
it's
hard because there's a lot in a book that you don't really realize, and then trying
yeah.
to, like, pick apart the pieces so that you can put the thread forward. I mean, that's a lot of work, especially if
Mhm.
you weren't expecting to.
Especially like for the cabin ones and in the woods and discovering little interesting nuances and things like that. Seems like isolation is a nice way of how you torture somebody. Well, it's not a nice way, but seems like that's a device you like to use.
Yeah.
Is that how much of that is present in what you're trying to do, and how much of it is feeling it out kind of giving them the isolation, or how much of it is like internalized isolation?
So, um and my like, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the statistics about loneliness in the world, and the statistics
Yeah.
are, we don't have, close-knit society anymore, right? Like, you don't have as many BFFs, you don't have a village raising your kids, we sit in our computers, and some of us work from home, so our interaction is the gas guy if you go in and buy a donut or whatever, right? Like,
And
so
if you want to get truly meta, the whole writing process is isolation on top of all of that, right?
right.
So
Unless you get on a video call, like I've got a girlfriend that I get on a video call with and we mute and we sprint together, just to have that sort of social interaction. So
that's
I think
that's
as a
nice.
writer, we can totally there isn't a level of isolation with us. And then
Right.
even like even with non like you get these ideas in your head when you start talking about them and people are like, "What?" I mean, that can also be, like, isolating, like, you don't wanna share that part of what you're talking about, so you're, like, with the normal people, and they're just like, "Oh, yeah, that's interesting," right? You're just like,
I'm backing away now.
"Yeah,
I'm
back
taking a couple
it
steps. Yeah.
So I think I do feel like we're more isolated now, and I think that unconsciously comes out in the characters.
Mhm.
where they are.
And especially a story about isolation in a lot of
Right,
respects, that's even more meta and even more like, the story within the story kind of aspect of it. And so
right.
I was curious because it is third person, how much, internal thought process did you not put out there? Was there a lot more that you were feeling as the characters that didn't come across the page that kind of you wanted to savor either to leak out for the big reveal or a special moment or something that you just needed to kind of round out the character and what they were going through at that point? Is there some of that in how you write?
Yeah, so what occurs to me, and it's not necessarily isolation. This is about Z and it's about honor. And he feels honor bound to do a lot of things regardless of whether he thinks they're right. Like he feels honor
Mhm.
bound to do things. And so he thought at one point in time that he needed to kill this child character as a
Mhm.
part because he thought it was going to save the world, right? And he's very conflicted. He loves kids, he's been saving the orphanage, he's been helping people out. He's a good guy, but there's like this honor thing. And so like so that came out. So you kind of put sprinkles of that going through. And then when that scene came, I hope that it came across that you could really feel his like conflict because it's a kid, right? But it's the world. So how do you balance those two things?
And part of the process too for a pantser is discovery, but it is also putting as much in your brain out onto the page too. So
Yep.
is that more
And
tailored
editing.
toward is that more tailored towards your editing brain then that you're trying to nuance that? And you
Yep.
you
So then you
you
go back and
actually
you're like, "Oh, I gotta make sure there's the gun, the smoking gun in that
you're
first
right.
scene in order
Yeah.
for it to work, and I need to make sure that he comes across like this way or that does not work at all." But you're right, like, when you first put it down on the page and you get there and you're like, "Okay, now I need to make this work," and go back to the threads, right, and have them go all the way through. So, yeah, I think that part's in the editing process. I wish I could let go like you were talking about doing and just, like, let it all out, but I think my brain gets a little too squirrely, so I have to do a
Rein it
little
in a
bit
little
of
bit.
corralling.
It's probably a smart way to do it, to be honest with you, because it's
Yeah,
a mess when you have to go through it again.
and then you're like, "Oh, cutting half, great, okay, moving on."
I mean, the good news is that I usually have more word. I'm never a lack of words. It's more of a lack of cohesion,
Right,
for me. So
right.
it's usually if I have a word, the word count in my head, it's never, oh, we need to add a scene. That's never a note I get. It's usually we need to cut this way back, kind of idea. But yeah,
That's so funny, I'm the exact opposite. I was like I tell my friend, like, all the things I have going on in the story, and then I'll be like, "And it's 30,000 words," and she's like, "What? It's like 30,000 words?" And I'm like,
are you smitten with the aspect of urban fantasy a little bit? Do you because you mentioned that a lot of it's taking place where you live or where you're from, and your new series is urban fantasy for the most part. So are you kind of enjoying that aspect of kind of putting some reality into the fantasy and to this into some science fiction as well?
I do. I struggled a little bit with silly things like, if you're in, so it was sort of set in Ely, Minnesota, but I didn't like the geography. So, like, I changed the lakes and I rearranged things and I added this. And then I'm like, at what point do you say, no, 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 this is not in Ely. This isn't a made up town.
Mhm.
But I did definitely try to, the businesses were, that business exists and they do that. These are the types of stores and what would the clothing that would be there during that season, right? Like I had
Mhm.
those sorts of thoughts in my head that yes, this isn't just fantasy or I can make up anything I wanted to. And as long as it kind of makes sense, you're good. There's like that grounding of reality, that rule set you have to go through.
Is your time travel take place in present time, or does it take place in the future or past, or
Mostly the future.
Mhm.
Yeah, yep. Um, the series did something where they would pull people forward from time, so,
Mhm.
people would get pulled so they traveled from the past to the future.
So
Yep,
you did have some specks of the reality you live in now in those books.
yep, yep. The '80s aerobics instructor had the leg warmers and had the, the purse that was right for that time period, and
The
yeah.
jelly bracelets and the
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the and the cassette player,
And
and
cassette player. Yes.
nice. Uh, yeah, with urban fantasy too, that there is kind of I find talking to urban fantasy writers that there's a tendency to want to over describe a little bit because you want the familiar to be familiar, right? And so have you found that being an aspect of working within something that is real a little bit in that respect, or is it just fantasy enough that you can kind of skate away from that a little bit?
It's fantasy enough, I think I can skate away from that a little bit, but
Hmm.
I do, there are things that you recognize in it, right? Like there's the way the computer looks in that time period, and there's, keyboards, right? Like there's little things that I try to
Mm.
pop in there that are, you know, um, true to the time period and people hopefully can visualize, but without me saying, and then the red table with the whatever,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
why I can write the historical romances, right? Because they describe the dresses and the ribbons and the hair and the shoes and the whole ballroom, and I'm like, "Woo, okay, moving on."
The other thing about it too is the aspect of I also find that oftentimes urban fantasy writers like to leave little Easter eggs for people who might be familiar with that area. Is that something that you like to do as well? You like to kind
Do.
of tease your fellow Minnesotans with a little bit of here you go, here's a little nostalgia for you or something you might recognize.
Yeah, there's a in one of the stories about a druid, they were actually hosting the magical spell that was going to make spell coming, and I had the location. There's this little in downtown Rochester. There's this like river that goes through it, and there's this walking path. That was this unmarked dog walking path. So the river on the one side and the trees on the other, and between like the main kind of roads, it was right there. And so like I had like, okay, you can see this, and yeah, or having the Mayo building in one of them, like,
Mm.
because there's some very distinctive what the buildings look like in Rochester. I had that in one of them from yeah, so yeah, those Easter eggs are kind of fun.
Has anybody found those and pointed them out to you?
No.
Get on it, Minnesotans. What are you
I
doing?
There you go, there you go.
You know, I want to kind of end our conversation before we get into the questionnaire a little bit about you mentioned that you're a big romance fan, and
Mhm.
so I'm curious about how you approach darker subject matter. And is there a little bit of, especially urban fantasy? Urban fantasy tends to be. It doesn't have to be YA. It doesn't have to be younger, but it does have that kind of younger mentality. Although now it's starting to get a little bit darker these
Everything
days
gets
too.
dark these days, yeah.
Yeah. But being a romance fan, is there a tendency or a thought process in your mind that goes through, softening something up or approaching the ending a little bit differently because you do want to showcase something that you love or understand?
So I like romances, I like happy endings, and so everything will eventually have a happy ending that I write. I just like that. So it's not
Mhm.
dark that way. But the path to get there might be a little, there's always
You throw it all in at the
betrayal.
beginning.
Yeah, there's always, and there's the best friend betrays them, and like there's always that sort of thing. But I hope that the justice and that sort of thing comes through. So the romance thing is that I want a happy ending. So even though there's going to be dragged through the dark, I want that happy ending. I'm not going to hit end the horror ending, right? Where like everybody dies or they all get,
Mm,
like I don't want that. I want something to happen. And even though there's losses because people die in my books, it's still like a happy ending. They come out stronger than before, and they come up, with friends and family and possibly a love interest, right? Like I
mm.
like I like ending it that way. So
Have
softer at
you
the
do have
end, mean in the middle.
you do have romance that goes throughout your books.
I have some side plots that are romance, yeah. Yep, but they're not the main thing.
All right, you know all the stigmas, you know all the language and all the idea of what people think of romance and what
Mhm,
romance is to people on the outside.
mhm.
For writers especially, that tends to be really stigmatized. Writers tend to be more critical and aspecting of, if you're not a romance writer, you're very usually, ooh, or this is so formula. There's so much that writers tend to judge when it comes to romance.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, from your perspective, you know, to introduce other writers to romance, what do you think romance shares with speculative fiction that people may not know it does because they're just judgmental about romance?
So I guess I'm gonna answer it this way. The thing about romance is that there's so many subgenres to romance. There is everything, and tropes are king or queen,
Mhm.
inside of there. And so, if you like speculative fiction, they have speculative fiction romance in there where everything is speculative and they've got time travel and whatever else you want inside of there.
Mhm.
They've got it. So, it's romance is more about, and you know more what you're getting, right? You know there's
Yeah.
gonna be the meet cute in the beginning, you know there's gonna be the happy ending, you know you're gonna get your thing in the middle that where they almost break up or they do break up and it looks really bad for them. But I would argue you get that in all stories, right? There's structure to stories where you have your quest in the beginning, you've got the wise man and all of the other, like depending upon which structure you believe in, there's all these little totem poles, whatever, that you go in, posts that you go in that hold your story up. And so I would argue that they're very similar in that they have structure and they have, most of the good stories, not all, have like a very distinctive structure that whether it's 3 act, save the cat, like whatever,
Mhm.
romance has that as well. And if you can it's a fun thing that you can really get into, and you can see all of these different worlds, and you can find love along the way, and you can have a happy moment, right? Like, it's a and not that there's not dark romance, because there's dark romance, right? Where some terrible things and axe murders and everything else happen, but, you know, there's a lot out there that, if you haven't
There's
tried romance, it's a good thing to try. Just
there's gothic romance too, where it's dark around the light, right? So yeah.
Right, right. I mean, it's so wide because so many people are drawn to the idea of love
Mhm.
and of finding that perfect person for you, whatever you look like, right?
Mhm. I mean, the search for science could be as romantic as search for love of another human could be, right? In a lot of respects too.
Yeah, it's about finding your passion.
Mhm. And all genres do that for the most part.
All genres do that. Yes, yes. They all have their things that they encompass or they're really good at, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
Are you partial to one genre over another that you've written in?
Oh, see, no, I vacillate. Like I really do like science just because of, the whole background on it, but there is something just really interesting about doing magic and having the magical system and having things be, all right, throw in a demon. It doesn't have to make sense. It can be from another world. Like you're just like, I'm going with it. Okay, whatever. So I just like having that element of unreality from our world, right? Like that you've got that little hint of something more because the science is usually future science, right? Where you're speculating about where we're going to go and what things might come together. So they're both kind of magic in their own way.
Nice.
Yeah.
I love that. That's great. Are you ever going to attempt to try to do a true romance again, or has that ship sailed?
Oh, I don't know, maybe. I struggle with, as much as I love them, I struggle with those beats. And you get in the middle of the story and it turns into something completely different.
Mhm.
The At the Cabin actually originally was a romance, and it didn't have any sort of elements inside of it, and then I rewrote it, and it worked better once it wasn't a romance and it had the fantastic elements in it.
Would then your name change from Claudia Blood to Claudia Love, maybe at that point?
Could you
If you
imagine?
do try romance?
That'd be awesome. Now I'd probably stick because I don't think people care what your name is anymore.
I don't yeah, I don't think it matters. I think like genre, just everybody's just searching for a good story and
Absolutely.
looking to be entertained, right? So
And that's the key, right? What author entertains you and maybe makes you think if that's what you want, or maybe makes you feel warm and comforted, or whatever else you're looking for in your reading experience.
Nice. All right, you ready to take the questionnaire?
Oh, sure. I'm ready.
All right, so we're about to do Le Questionnaire, invented by the great Bernard Pivot, and then perfected by, in my personal opinion, by James Lipton and in his series Inside the Actor Studio, and stolen by me to kind of torture my guests. So, Claudia Blood, what is your favorite word to write?
My favorite word to write. Wow. The first word that popped up is eloquent. I don't know why. It had a Q. I'm in.
His least favorite word to write.
Moist.
That's a popular one, I think. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
What turns you on either creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Um, Having that moment when it clicks. And I
Nice.
don't know if you've had that moment, but where everything, the story, the characters, everything, and you're just like,
Nice.
yeah.
So then, what turns you off?
Um, uh, okay, what turns off my creativity is when I'm in the zone doing the pantsing and I just wrote something that doesn't make any goddamn sense for the whole entire story, and then I'm dead in the water until I can figure out why.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Everybody's favorite. What is your favorite curse word?
Ill-begotten son of a terminally ill wombat.
Nice. I love that. That's fantastic. That's awesome. All right. So, what is your favorite noise, or what sound or noise do you love? Sorry.
Sound or noise do I love? I love laughter. That sounds really stupid, but I love hearing people laugh. Not the like derisive laughter, but like where
Mhm.
they're happy, they're excited.
Nice. So, what sound or noise do you dislike?
Oh, the sneering. Oh God, that's so soul crushing. Sneering is so soul crushing.
Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah.
What character of yours would put their face on the currency of their world?
Ravine.
You
Yep.
didn't even hesitate. You
No,
knew right
no,
off the bat.
it's Ravine. Yep. Yep.
That's awesome. What other artistry would you love to try to do that you haven't attempted already?
Oh, that I haven't attempted? I
Mhm.
wanna learn how to weld. I wanna learn how to do those big metal sculptures and, like, weld it all together. I'm not handy, so I don't know why I want to do this, but I absolutely do wanna do it someday.
What artistry will you never try?
Um, what artistry? Well, okay, so I do like, I used to make jewelry and do crayons and art and, like, paint and things like that, so what would I guess I wouldn't ever try, making the stained glass windows
Mm.
for whatever reason. I mean, just the idea of me in glass just seems wrong. It's gonna break, it's gonna be terrible. Yeah, that's a hospital visit waiting to happen.
All right. So, if heaven exists or whatever you believe exists beyond this life, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive?
Oh, okay, the first thing that came to mind is nice job. Good job. You did good. You did good with your life.
Well, Miss Claudia Blood, I have to say, nice job. This was a fantastic, fantastic talk, fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk to me about everything that's going on and all of your interesting intricacies and the way you torture your characters. It's been a fantastic conversation. Tell everybody where they can find these wonderful books of yours.
ClaudiaBlood.com. I'm a wide author, so they're on all vendors.
Nice.
Amazon, Kobo, the whole works. Smashwords.
Awesome. Everybody go check those out. And remember that it's always time to go to now. And come back on our channel here in a little bit. We're going to do late night news with me and Vanessa Junta. And we've got a Q&A going. So come back and ask us a bunch of questions. But otherwise, yeah, it's always time to go to now. We'll see you guys next time. Bye, everybody.